You're all very welcome, and I'm delighted to introduce Steve Chester on my left, who's the Director of Media in ISBA, and ISBA is the Incorporated Society of British Advertisers, and Sam Tomlinson, partner in PwC. Ryan Roach from Owens DDB is here to manage the tech requirements to ensure that everything runs smoothly. I was fortunate enough to see Steve and Sam present the findings of this seminal new study via a WFA webinar in Singapore, of all places. So I kind of hijacked a pair of them during this webinar and asked them to present this to an AAI audience in Ireland, and they very kindly agreed to do so. And I'm delighted that they're sharing these learnings with us here this morning. Before I hand over, let me remind you of a study which I shared with the marketing and advertising industry here in Ireland back in 2017. Bob Liodice, who's the CEO of the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers in the States, presented an alarming deck, which was entitled Media Transparency Guidance to Marketers. It was based on a K2 intelligence report, an independent study conducted over a 9-month period. And he said that the digital ecosystem needs to be less opaque. For every $1,000 spent on digital programmatic advertising, there are financial and exposure losses. 40% of the spend goes into the pockets of the media owners. 20% of the spend goes in ad fraud, and a further 20% of the spend goes in ad blocking. And if you're fortunate or lucky enough, 20% of that spend will hit your target audience. This was a very revealing report, and it was based in the States on a study over a 9-month period. And remember, that was 2017. And in 2018, David Weldon was a guest of the Marketing Society here in Ireland. And he said that ad fraud is now the second biggest crime in the world. However, for the purpose of today, I'm parking ad fraud, because in this study, fraud is not believed to be an issue, given PwC were matching only monetized impressions. And on May the 15th, ISBA released this study on transparency within the programmatic supply chain. The report, conducted with PwC, builds on the WFA's and ANA programmatic studies published in 2014 and 2017. Have things improved? I'll now hand over to Steve and Sam to take it from here. For those of you who want to ask questions, do so via the chat box. We'll try to address these at the end of the webinar, or maybe they'll be answered as Steve and Sam go through their respective presentations. I suspect that's going to be the case. Anyway, without further ado, over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Barry. So I'll give just a couple of minutes lead in, and I'll pass to Sam to present the results. And then we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A afterwards. So the origins of this study hark back to sort of 2018, when we were looking and planning with our members about what we could do which would help them in their day-to-day work, and particularly looking at the perennial issue of media supply chain transparency. So we look at all media supply chains, of course. And when we asked our members and said, what would have the most impact, what would give you the most insight, they very quickly settled on the notion of programmatic supply chain transparency, and saying we want to actually understand better understand how programmatic buying works in the UK, but also globally. We very simply want to know who's in their supply chain, how much do they cost, and then be able to work out the relative value of their partners in the supply chain. Because of course, both advertisers and publishers don't have an end-to-end view of their own supply chain. There's of course disclosed and non-disclosed buys, and this study focused on disclosed buys only, where the parties and the fees they charge are disclosed. For undisclosed, of course, there were no audit rights, and the clients don't have those audit rights, so they were not included in the study. So what we want to do is to sort of build clearly on good work that had already been done, rather than just simply replicating studies which have been done in other markets. What could we do to build upon this? And as Barry said, we took a lot of inspiration from the WFA study in 2014, which I think many of you on the call would have seen, which was a guide to programmatic, and it also had the seminal waterfall, actually looking at, starting with the euro, how many cents in the euro actually lands with the end publisher, and then what was the take of each of the parties in the supply chain. And it showed roughly about 40 cents in the euro arriving with the publisher. The ANA then did a study, so that was asking for, what were the margins globally at that point, and actually a study was asking people what the margins were. The ANA then 3 years later, our American cousins, did a forensic study, so they looked at the really granular data and log file data, and they looked at the data going all the way through the supply chain up until the ad exchange itself, the SSP itself. But they couldn't see beyond that because they only had buy-side data, but it was a real forensic look, and it was a great piece of work. And then they sought to estimate the money they thought and the margins beyond the SSP and how much money was landing with the publisher. And they estimated a slightly better picture of just over 50 cents in the euro arriving with the publisher. And then there have been various other studies done by publishers themselves, of course, who've been buying their own media. So they're marketers themselves, and the marketing division bought their own inventory so they could see how much money was going in and then how much money was coming out back to them as a publisher. And that showed a varying picture over the last 3 to 4 years. And PwC had worked with one of these parties to do so, and so very much had some great insight and had a methodology for matching data in that respect. So our approach was then to say, actually, we want to try and do an end-to-end study at scale. So to do that, we needed both advertisers and giving their permission to their data. We also needed publishers. So we worked with the Publisher Association in the UK, the AAP, and we netted out with having 15 advertisers and 12 publishers who agreed to take part in the study, so we could then match spend going through the supply chain. And then we very quickly needed to find an auditor that could do that. So we settled very quickly on the world-class auditing capabilities of PwC, because clearly they are a massive and enormous name from a financial auditing point of view, but they also have skin in the game and a lot of experience both in media auditing and specifically with programmatic auditing. So we put that together and agreed and worked on that and spent 2018 scoping out and saying, this is what we want to do. We want it to be end-to-end, getting PwC on board. And as Sam will touch on in a moment, that was the point when we properly started the project at the beginning of 2019. And we thought that the project would take 9 months in total. That was building in a buffer. But as Sam will touch on in a moment, the difficulties with getting the data were perhaps central to this entire study, and the challenges which talk to the wider structure of the industry and how it needs to be changed, because at the moment there is theoretically clients and publishers have access to their data, which allows this type of auditing. In practice, that is not the case. So we'll go into the details about why that occurred and the challenges in just a moment. So just to round out, we came out with some key actions from the study to carry forward, and we'll talk about those at the end of the presentation about how we're carrying those forward. And it requires cross-industry change. And I think there may be those who will say, well, why is this a catalyst to change? What's it different about the study to others? And I think it's about timing as well as the specific nature of the insights from this study, which build on other studies that have been done by WFA, ANA, and other independent studies. But I think it's timing at the moment. There is a lot of regulatory scrutiny in the UK particularly, but also in Europe, but also emerging scrutiny in the US and other markets in Australia too, from both governments and regulatory authorities about looking at the programmatic supply chain, notably, but looking at the digital supply chain and the fairness within it. And there is regulatory interest in this. So we have to be able to demonstrate there is a fair, open, transparent, accountable supply chain. And if we don't, I think there's a real threat of regulatory intervention. So those are the table stakes. So we have to lean into, I think, the recommendations and try and drive that change. And we want to do that globally, not just locally in the UK. But without further ado, I'll pass to Sam. But just a final thanks to Sam and his team for the amount of time they've spent on this project. We'd originally anticipated 9 months, I think, in total to work on this. It's taken 2 years, although we put a significant investment via our members to develop and bring this study to bear. It has cost PwC many times the investments. Such has been the delays and the challenges with actually overseeing this. So my final thanks goes to Sam and team, and across to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Tomlinson, partner at PwC. I've been with PwC for 20 years, and my background is I'm a qualified accountant, qualified auditor. So I've spent my 20-year career doing financial and operational audits of media owners, of media agencies, and of tech vendors. And I set up and lead our marketing and media assurance team. The skills that we brought to this team, so you have people like myself from an audit background, We had our programmatic specialists led by Paddy Turley, who spent 10 years in ad tech before joining PwC. And we had our data scientists led by Laura Shrum, who's spent her whole career doing data science work in marketing and media. So we had the right combination of skills in audit, programmatic, and data science. We also knew that this type of work could be done because, as Steve's alluded to, we worked with a UK publisher a few years ago who bought their own ad inventory anonymously, identified money was missing en route, exercised their right of audit over one of their SSPs. It was my team that went in to unpick what had happened, and there was a substantial out-of-court settlement in favour of the publisher. So we knew we had the right team. We knew that this type of end-to-end study could be done. The bit that we got horrendously wrong was underestimating the challenges with actually getting the data in the first place. And I will talk to this in more detail when I put the slides up in a second, but we completely underestimated how hard it would be for advertisers and publishers to access their own data. And we also underestimated the variability and, frankly, the weakness of some of the quality of that data once we received it. So if you take one thing from today's presentation, it's the need for industry-wide collaboration to drive standardization of data access and data quality. And that's the real headline, and that's the real finding from the study. So with that, I will share my screen. So you should hopefully all be able to see my screen now. And what I'm going to present here is the full study, which went to the participants, was a 90-page document. There is a public 20-page document available on the ISBA website, and it's effectively that 20-page document that I'm going to be presenting today. So afterwards, we can share a link with you to the public version of this, so that you have copies of these materials. So first of all, looking at the participants, we had 15 major advertisers, members of ISBA, all big UK advertisers, many of them big global advertisers. And we had 12 premium publishers coordinated by the Association of Online Publishers, which is the UK premium publisher body. The 8 agencies and the 5 DSPs were a function of which advertisers took part, and the 6 SSPs are a function of which publishers took part. One thing to note on the DSPs and SSPs, we had Google in there on both sides. So we have Google as DSP, DV360, and Google as SSP, Google Ad Manager. The other tech vendors were on one side or other, but not both. In terms of the study challenges, the most important of these is the first one, which is what we've called chicken and egg permissioning. So I really want to try and bring this to life with an example. 9 months ago, we had the 15 advertisers, the 8 agencies, the 12 publishers, all signed up, ready and wanting to share their data. But it actually took 9 months to get that data. And to give an example of why, typically, after the publishers had signed up, what they said to us was, hey, PwC, we have theoretical contractual rights to log level, that is impression level data from our SSP, but we've never asked for it. We don't know how to ingest or filter it or share it with you. Could you just go to the SSP and get it direct from them? When we got to the SSPs, their response was typically, oh, that's a bit awkward because our arrangement with the DSP means that we can only share this data with our client, the publisher, not a publisher's representative, which is what you are, PwC. So the SSPs felt they needed a contractual amendments or variations or specific legal permissioning from the DSPs to share this data. And this is where it starts to get complicated. You then have 6 SSPs, each going separately to 5 DSPs, each asking for a slightly different contractual variation or permission. So that's immediately 30 sets of permissioning chains. Most of those 5 DSPs felt they needed to go back to the agency trading desks that were buying the impressions. So you've then got 240 permissioning chains. Those 8 agency trading desks typically felt they needed to go to their parent agency, in turn, who went to the end advertiser. All this had taken months and months and months, by which point the advertisers are tearing their hair out saying, well, of course we want to share this data, We initiated the study, set it up, funded it 9 months ago, and can't figure out why nothing much seems to have happened since. And I absolutely understand that each individual component of the supply chain is behaving rationally, but you end up with a systemically irrational result. Fundamentally, the supply chain should serve advertisers and publishers. And if they and agencies wanted to share data, that should be able to happen in a matter of days. It should never take 9 months. Once we had the data, the main challenge then was the fourth item there, which we've called data formatting and fidelity. We already knew that there was no unique transaction ID that enables you to match an impression from buy side to sell side. But in addition, what we hadn't anticipated was the lack of consistent data definitions or data taxonomies, data fields either mislabeled or left blank, at least half a dozen date formats alone. Some tech vendors find it much harder than others to filter and share log level data. And in aggregate, these data quality challenges make it very hard to match impressions from buy side to sell side, which we'll talk to on the next slide. Oh, sorry, one other point. It is worth just noting with these data access delays, we were not asking for GDPR sensitive data. We were consistently very clear, all we wanted was basic transaction data. So although privacy was often used as quoted as a reason for delay, we weren't asking for sensitive private data. Now, sorry, excuse me, someone at the door at the same time, the joys of home working. I'll now turn to the study methodology. So effectively, we gathered data across our advertisers and publishers for the 3-month period from January to March 2020. The intention then was to match those impressions from buy side to sell side. And what I mean by an impression matching is literally, because there's no unique transaction ID, you need to be able to clearly identify when an impression or group of impressions on the buy side is the same impression or group of impressions on the sell side. Once you've done that, you have a match and you can start to construct the full supply chain. So we received 267 million impressions that were being served from our study advertisers through the study tech vendors to the study publishers. If we had successfully matched all of those from buy side to sell side, that would have been 100% match rate. What we actually achieved was a 31 million matched impressions, which is a 12% match rate. Now, on the one hand, 31 million is a big number, and we can be very confident that our report accurately describes what we found in those 31 million impressions. But on the other hand, 12% is obviously a disappointingly low match rate, and 31 million in the scale of all programmatic is a mere drop in the ocean. So we have been challenged quite a lot since the study was published on, is our study really representative of all programmatic? So I want to be really clear, we do not think our study is representative, and we've never claimed that. This study was premium by its very nature. It was premium advertisers, premium publishers, the biggest, best known tech vendors. So it was always premium. Even within that world, we could only match the 12% of impressions that had the best quality data. So it's become like a super premium or best of the best scenario. So it is highly unlikely that our study findings are representative of either the 88% of lower quality unmatched impressions, and it's certainly unlikely to be representative of long tail publishers and long tail tech vendors. We don't have any data on the long tail. Obviously, if I was placing a bet, my bet would be in the long tail, less money reaching publishers and more money in the unknown delta. Those 31 million impressions represented 290 distinct supply chains. A distinct supply chain is any unique route of getting from an advertiser to a publisher. Just a couple of other points to note. This was a study in the UK conducted in pounds sterling, but programmatic tech operates in US dollars. So you do have to do quite a bit of swapping from sterling to dollars and back again. And then it's also worth just touching here on fraud. As was mentioned in the introduction, what we were doing here was matching monetized matched impressions. We could see impressions on the buy side We're trying to match to impressions on the sell side. If advertiser spend has been diverted to a fraudulent website, then by definition, there's no impression with our premium study publishers. So ad fraud is undoubtedly a significant issue for programmatic, but it's happening before our 31 million matched impressions. So our waterfall excludes any of that kind of classic ad fraud. So our findings. This is our study waterfall, which many of you will be familiar with. It's been widely reproduced in much of the trade press coverage. What we're going to do in the next few slides is I've got basically one slide on each element just to talk through what we found. First is around agency fees, which represented 7% of gross programmatic spend. This was never designed to be an exercise in benchmarking agency fees. If that's your objective, you don't need a full 15-month end-to-end study to do it. What we did find is that the agencies offer a wide variety of service models and fee models, but actually, which makes comparability very hard. But as a percentage, they all ended up pretty much clustered at about the same level, only 1 or 2 percentage points variation in either direction. What we did see was much bigger variability in the quality of the agency teams. Some were outstanding, some much less so. So if I was a brand, I would not be focused on the commission rate, because that is always going to end up in a pretty small band. I would be very focused on making sure that I had the best quality team on my account, and I would pay more if necessary to secure them, because that's where the real variability lies. This next slide combines DSP costs and what we've called technology fees. So I'll talk through each of these elements. There's 18 columns here because some advertisers use 2 DSPs. So some of the 15 advertisers are in here twice. The brown bar at the bottom represents DSP fees. These averaged 8% for the study. Google was by far the most commonly used, DV360, and that averaged 7%, so very close to the study average. And as you can see here, not much variability. Then you have the gray bar, which is ad serving costs, again, small and not variable. Verification fee, which is the use of fraud, viewability, and brand safety tools, such as Double Verify or IAS or Moat. Again, quite small, not much variability. The part that is hugely variable is the orange bar at the top, and that's the use of third-party audience data. So some instances, like column 1, 0 spend on third-party data. Some, like 5, 6, and 10, 25% or more of programmatic spend being spent on third-party data. And we've said to all of the participants that there's no right or wrong here, that this is just different strategies. But what we would say is if you as a brand are spending heavily on third-party data, you'd want to be very confident it generates a good return on investment. And separately, not from this study, but other work that our team has done, other projects have left us generally impressed and supportive of high-quality, certified publisher first-party data. So we're generally big fans of publisher first-party data. Whenever we've tried to assess the quality of third-party audience data, we've been disappointed by its accuracy and integrity. So I think there's some important messages here for planning your programmatic spend. Next, we'll turn to SSP fees. I'm just going to return to the waterfall for 1 second, just to remind you of something. So SSP fees here represented 8% of advertiser spend. But of course, the way SSPs contract is with a publisher. So they actually charge a percentage of publisher revenues, which is obviously off a much smaller denominator than advertiser spend. So that 8% of ad spend is equivalent to about 14% of publisher revenues, which is much closer to what the sorts of numbers you will hear when you hear publishers talking about an SSP take rate. Some of the SSPs, not all, but some, gave us a good quality data set, which means we got gross revenue coming into the SSP, less the SSP's own fees, and then net revenue being passed to the publisher. And where you have that sort of data set, you can then compare the rate being charged in the data with the contractual rate between the SSP and the publisher. And obviously those two things ideally should be the same. And that's what we have in column 2, a perfect match between actual rate and contracted rates. But of course, what you can also see is that most of the columns aren't like column 2. In most of the columns, or in many of them, the fee being charged in the data exceeded the contractual fee. This does not automatically mean SSPs are overcharging, because we had a snapshot of impressions here, and they might be truing up to their contractual rate either over a larger volume of impressions or through their invoicing process at month end or quarter end. What it does suggest, though, is that if you are a publisher, you should pay close attention to what your SSP is charging you to make sure it genuinely does reflect your contract. And we saw a similar pattern, not quite as stark, but a similar pattern on the DSP side. So in terms of DSP charging, it can vary in the data from what's in the contracts. So if you are going through an agency, remind your agency to regularly check what the DSP is charging. Or if you have taken out a DSP contract direct, make sure you're running those checks yourself. This chart shows the amount of money getting through to each of our 12 publishers as a percentage of advertiser spend. Some publishers, highly successful. So publisher 4, 67% was the highest in our study. Conversely, publisher 6 down at 49%. We've cautioned everybody not to read too much into these peer comparisons. The study was always designed to surface industry-wide issues. The challenges with data access and data quality mean that it is hard to be truly confident in the comparability here. Ideally, if the data access and data quality issues are resolved over the next 18 months, you could rerun this type of study in 2 years with really clean, robust data, which would give you a much more meaningful peer comparison. With that caveat, our takeaway generally was that publishers who work with a smaller number of SSPs seemed to find it easier to manage those SSPs more closely and seem to have more money getting through to them from the advertiser. But that was a generalization. There were exceptions to that. We then cut the data in a couple of different ways. So we had 31 million matched impressions, of which 13 million were not tagged as display or video, which is evidence of those data quality issues I touched on earlier. Of the 18 million that were tagged, 97% were display. So with a caveat that the volume of impressions under the video pie chart is not huge, with that caveat, it does still look that more money is getting through to the publisher for video impressions than display. As a reminder here, YouTube was not a participant. When we talk about video here, we mean video impressions on a news or magazine website. The fact that more money gets through on video is what we would expect. Smaller volume of impressions, fewer tech intermediaries, simpler, better controlled supply chains. And then we did a similar cut, open versus private marketplace. 31 million matched impressions, 11 million not tagged. Of the 20 million that were, 18 million were open and 2 million were private marketplace. So again, a slight caveat that the volume of impressions under the right-hand pie chart is not huge, but more money does seem to be getting through in the private marketplace, which again is what we would expect. We have been asked quite a few times, why isn't that delta bigger? And we think what's happening here is our open marketplace is a super premium, best of the best scenario, as I described earlier. It's premium study to start with. It's the best quality matched impressions. I'm pretty confident if you moved into long tail programmatic, the amount getting through in the open marketplace would shrink, and you'd then have a bigger differential between the open and the private marketplace. And then finally, we come to the unknown delta, which has obviously captured a lot of the trade press headlines. So just to explain what the delta is, the delta represents a discrepancy between what the DSP says is leaving the DSP and what the SSP says is coming in to it. And in a perfect world, those two things should match. And we did see many impressions where the delta was 0. But we also saw many impressions with significant differences. The single biggest impression delta was 85%. And the middle two quartiles, the second and third quartiles, i.e. the middle 50% of impressions, their deltas ranged from 2% to 23%. and averaged 15%. Now, the study data can't tell us what causes the delta. The study data just tells us the delta is there. Obviously, we do have some hypotheses, and these have come from our own team, from work we've done previously. They've come from those on our team who used to work in ad tech. They've come from the tech vendors themselves, who during the private briefings, as we came to the end of the study, many of them suggested possible causes. And we also had kind of off-record chats with people in the industry. And we concluded that the delta most likely reflects a combination of data quality limitations, which meant occasional manual calculations. I'll give one example. I said earlier, some SSPs gave us a good data set, but some didn't. So a couple of the SSPs, including Google, only were able to provide publisher net revenue. What you then have to do is gross that up using the contract for the SSP's own fees to arrive at SSP gross revenue to then compare with what's coming out of the DSP. And obviously, when you're making those manual calculations, there might be reasons why the SSP is not charging in line with contract on that impression. That could drive the delta. And then we have other causes, such as DSP or SSP fees not being reported in the study data shared with us. Examples of that might be post-auction bid shading. So the winning bid's determined, money starts to flow, and then a tech vendor applies an additional fee but doesn't report that to us. That would drive the delta. There might be rebate arrangements between a tech vendor and another part of the supply chain. That could drive the delta. Foreign exchange definitely plays a part because programmatic tech operates in US dollars. So the rates and the roundings might have an effect. There might be some inventory reselling between tech vendors. Generally, we think that's a bigger problem in long tail, but it could be a factor here. And of course, there could be other unknown factors. The only way we'll know is to resolve the issues around data access and data quality. Once you've done that, you can investigate the delta, hopefully drive it down for the benefit of advertisers and publishers. Just a couple of slides to go. One of the things that we did do was we looked at advertiser and agency use of different verification tools. The most interesting one here is the penultimate one, the inclusion list, also commonly known as a whitelist. So 12 of the 15 advertisers were running inclusion lists, and that should, in theory, restrict the number of websites they can appear on. Despite that, and remember, this was 3 months of data only, UK only, the average number of websites that was used was 40,000. And we've said to all of the advertisers, you know, we're not here to critique programmatic strategy, but 40,000 websites for one country for 3 months strikes us as a lot. Just to try to break that down a bit, about half the advertisers that took part were at about 6,000 websites or fewer, which we would generally regard as pretty good practice. The others ranged from 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, and the highest was up at 150,000. So, you know, if you are a premium brand, we would question whether more than 10,000 websites, certainly we would question whether 40,000 websites is a good idea, because obviously risks around fraud, viewability, and brand safety increase in that long tail, as well as an increased risk of spend leakage. And then finally, recommendations. 2 key recommendations, which you'll have heard me reference already. The first is around that need for industry-wide collaboration to drive standardization for data access and data quality. There's a working group that's been set up in the UK, an industry task force, which Steve can talk to in a minute. Once we've resolved the data access and the data quality, you can then properly investigate the delta, drive that 15% downwards for the benefit of advertisers and publishers. And so that is a whistle-stop tour of the study. I appreciate that that's a lot of information in a short space of time. What I'd suggest is maybe Steve talks briefly about the industry task force, and then very happy to respond to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So the 2 key critical conclusions from the report, the legal access and standardization of the data was the first, just to recap, was the first recommendation. So trying to get to the data and trying to standardize legal terms and legal access so that both advertisers and publishers and their representatives, including auditors, can access that data readily. That was part 1. And then when you get to that data, making sure that granular data is like for like on both sides of the fence. So the buy side data at the DSP and the sell side data at the SSP to make sure it's like for like. And then we would then hope then in future studies, rather than having a 12% match rate, we have to discard 88% of the impressions because it simply isn't matchable, that you could match close to, if not 100%. So that's number one, recommendation number one. Number two then is, once you have that standardization, then to look at the drivers of this unattributable 15%, the 15% that can't be attributed to any one party. So we've launched a cross-industry group in the UK with the trade associations. So there's ourselves representing advertisers, the AAP representing publishers who are our partners in this report. But we've also brought on board the IPA representing agencies in the UK, and also the IAB representing the ad tech community, but also a broader brethren of some publishers and agencies who are also part of their membership as well. So we're, at the moment, well, that's why we don't have any slides to indicate on this at the moment. We've had 2 meetings of this group. We're just putting together essentially the mission statement. There is a draft mission statement and a structure for this group. Essentially, it'll be comprised of a steering group with the trade associations and representative members, and then it will have those 2 work streams looking at the data standardization and then the legal standardization of legal terms, which gives standardization of legal access to the data, which is really important as well. So we think this is going to be a body of work that's going to take a couple of years realistically to create change. We think the legal access and drawing up the legal terms, ironically, may be quicker, because on the data standardization, we're not trying to fundamentally change the way these businesses operate. We're trying to say that the data by which they demonstrate and actually show the performance of their business, it has standardized terms, and they deliver in a standardized way, so that when companies like PwC access the log file data, they can get that granular impression by impression data. When they grab, and they can look at it on both sides of the fence, and they can follow the money right through the supply chain. So that's going to take time for these businesses to not only to agree on that path forward, but to obviously then implement. And the majority of the businesses, of course, are based in the US as well. So we're going to need to work with product teams, both based in Europe and based in the US as well, to create that change. So that's going to be a body of work over the next 2 years. And certainly we can share with this group in the next few weeks, because I think it will take about another month to 6 weeks just to finalize the structure of that group and its mission statement and its and tentative body of work. And what we'd like to try and do as well is to try and build an international coalition behind this as well. So we'd love to work with parties with AAI and with other trade body partners around the world as well, to essentially to feed into this work and to back this work. Because honestly, from all the discussions that Sam and I have had globally with different parties, these are common issues to the entire supply chain, whether it's based in APAC, Europe, Americas. This is to do with just fundamental structure of data and access to it, which is common to every single market. So it doesn't matter who are the major players in any given market, the results would be very similar and be the same. But the fundamental issues of making sure the data is, the fidelity of it is like for like, is common to all. And that legal access to data at the moment is a challenge, because often, although programmatic is quite a young industry, it's only really 13 years old, many of these contracts are out of date, and they're based on individual terms and conditions, which Sam said, an individual contract is very reasonable and you have to observe the contract. But then when you look at it, we have a much bigger supply chain here, and when you look at it in aggregate, you just have all these bespoke contracts, which means that some clients would have access to data, others wouldn't, and the same for publishers as well. There needs to be standardized terms of reference for everybody to use in the industry, a standard SLA, if you will. So that's going to be a body of work over the next couple of years, and we're going to look at it in 3 ways. Essentially, look at whether existing standards, and Sam mentioned just in the advertiser recommendations there are a couple of standards in the IAB that they've developed, and they're quite relatively new. Of course, sellers.json and supply chain objects, essentially these would help to prevent reselling and would help to identify parties in the supply chain. So we think those are good, and so we think there are existing standards which we can put our foot in the accelerator to and adopt those and make them must-haves rather than opt-in solutions. We want to look at what we're calling private enterprise solutions. So there are many emerging blockchain and non-blockchain companies who are developing solutions that allow for and promote supply chain transparency. So we'll have a look at those as well in our investigation. And then where neither existing standards or private companies who have a solution which they might want to bring to bear, which the group could back, we may need to look at developing new standards, new solutions, new frameworks. So that's going to be the approach over the next couple of years, and hence why we're going to take our time to make sure we get this right. But we do have a timetable we need to keep, and we do have that government scrutiny, certainly in the UK, certainly in Australia, whose Competition Commission is also looking at the supply chain, and also clearly on the European front as well, an ever-present oversight really from regulatory authorities and government authorities. So there is that sort of impetus to keep us honest and make sure we actually then define and create and drive progress over the next couple of years, and we don't drag our feet in this because there is that interest. Because of course there's always the threat of regulatory intervention if we do not try and drive that necessary change. So we'll share more with that with the AAI and others throughout the globe over the next 6 weeks, and we'll start to build this international coalition.
Thanks, Steve. And if there's anything we in the AAI can do to help, please shout. It's a question that came in for me during, Sam, your presentation. As an advertiser, a big advertiser, what's my main concern in this whole programmatic area? I know you've highlighted many of them, but I mean, how can I be guaranteed that if I'm asked a question in the boardroom, that my money is being transparently spent through programmatic?
So I think there's certainly a number of steps that you can take as a brand. So if I was a brand, the first thing I would do is make sure that I'd appointed a really strong agency team to support me. Yeah. It's not critical, but generally we would recommend that big brands hold a DSP contract direct. That's a nice to have. It's not essential, but it certainly helps, because then you have ready access to your own data at any time you want it. But either way, once you've appointed a high quality agency team, I personally would, particularly for brand campaigns, I would instruct that agency team to focus primarily on private marketplace. I'd ensure I had a really robust inclusion list or whitelist for any campaign that I was running, and that inclusion list was updated regularly. And I would want assurances that my agency was regularly downloading log level data from the DSP and running analytics on it to understand what is working and what is not in your programmatic spend. If you get all of those things right, I don't think that automatically means the delta disappears, but it certainly would give you the best possible chance of reducing the delta. And it also means that your ads are appearing on the right websites in the right context, which is an important boardroom consideration too.
Yeah, and I would say just add to that, I would recommend a disclosed model. It's important, and I think not just from a commercial point of view, but we know from the last couple of years, we bear the scars from it as well, about the necessary scars for having to observe data regulation as well, both in Europe and emerging in the US and other markets as well. It is really important. How can you know if you're observing data regulation if you don't know who's in your supply chain? So there is a legal aspect to knowing who's in your supply chain and making sure that you are fully buttoned down and understanding how that data is transacted and what your partners are doing with that data, but commercially as well. And this is obviously focusing on the commercial side, this particular report, of knowing who's in your supply chain and how much they cost, because we believe, we are believers and backers of programmatic advertising. And going into this study, we believe in programmatic advertising, but it has somewhat of a handbrake applied to it, and that handbrake needs to be released. It can perform even better. And it's important that you understand who's in your supply chain, how much they cost, and what value they're driving, and fairly remunerate those partners, of course, as well. But you need to understand how much they're charging, what value they're driving first, and then optimize accordingly. But I think that data regulation aspect, it's vital who's in your supply chain. So I think that's why a disclosed model and actually understanding the full provenance of your media is vitally important.
Very good. I don't see any questions coming up, Steve and Sam, because I think you've answered most of them as you're going through your presentation. I would like to congratulate both ISBA and PwC for this breakthrough piece of work. It's really fascinating and very revealing, and it can only be good for our industry as long as we continue to learn from it. So, Sam, there's one quick question I have to ask you. You said you went into this piece of work with a 9-month deadline and it took 2 years. Was there ever a point you said, no, I've got to stop this. I can't stop spending it. I can't keep spending this sort of money anymore.
That's a brilliant question. Yeah. So the thought crossed our mind. It honestly did. We were funded. The aggregate funding we received from the ISBA members was £300,000. It ended up costing us more than £1 million because of the data access delays. And yes, so at one point, definitely the thought crossed our minds to simply refund the 300,000 and give up and walk away. I'm really pleased that we didn't do that. It has been it's been one of the most fascinating projects of my 20-year career, and I genuinely believe it can be a catalyst for positive change. So I do say whenever we present this, my team is pro-programmatic, so the ability to target advertising messages is hugely beneficial. We just want to see programmatic done well, and one of the things the study shows is that even at the premium end, programmatic could be 15% even better, if you like, if you could drive down that delta. So we want to see programmatic done well, and we are really keen to work with brands and publishers that share that aspiration.
Excellent. Guys, I'm going to wrap it. We're under the hour. Thanks again, Steve, and to Sam, and to Brian for managing the tech part of this. It's been a fascinating webinar, very revealing, and really appreciate your efforts and your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. All the best.